There is something uniquely infuriating about being told you are breaking rules that do not apply to you, by people who have no authority over you whatsoever. It is one thing to deal with an HOA that oversteps within its own boundaries. It is something else entirely when they walk onto land that was never part of their organization, never subject to their rules and never under their jurisdiction, and start issuing violations like they own the place. 2 HOA enforcement officers showed up on my vineyard one morning with clipboards and citations, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged before. By the time they left, that confidence was completely gone, and the bill that followed made sure they never made that mistake again. Let me take you back to the beginning. I own a small vineyard on the edge of a residential area. It is a working agricultural property that I have operated for several years. The land is separately titled Zoned Agricultural and has its own legal identity completely distinct from the residential neighborhood that developed around it over time. The HOA that governs that neighborhood has clear boundaries defined in their own founding documents, and my vineyard sits entirely outside those boundaries. I am not a member. I have never been a member. I have never paid dues, attended meetings, or agreed to any of their guidelines because I have never had any legal obligation to do so. This was not a gray area. It was not a matter of interpretation. My property was simply not in their HOA. Full stop. For the most part, this had never been an issue. The HOA and I existed in parallel without much interaction. Occasionally, a board member would send a letter suggesting that my vineyard operations were affecting the neighborhood in some way, and I would respond clarifying my property's status, and that would be the end of it. Simple, professional, resolved quickly. Then a new enforcement team was hired. The HOA had contracted with a third-party enforcement company to handle violations and inspections within the community. These were not volunteer board members. They were paid professionals whose job was to identify violations and issue citations, and apparently somewhere in the transition to this new system, the clear boundary lines of the HOA's jurisdiction had not been communicated with the precision they required. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, I was working in the vineyard when I looked up and saw 2 people in HOA-branded shirts walking through my property. They had a clipboard, a camera, and the purposeful stride of people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They were photographing my irrigation setup, making notes and moving through the rows of vines like they were conducting an official inspection. I walked over and asked them what they were doing. They introduced themselves as HOA enforcement officers and told me they were conducting a routine property inspection. One of them informed me that they had identified several potential violations on the property, including unapproved structures, non-compliant irrigation visible from the road, and what they described as unsanctioned agricultural activity in a residential zone. I stood there for a moment, making sure I had heard correctly. Unsanctioned agricultural activity on my vineyard, which was zoned agricultural and was not in their HOA. I asked them one question. I asked them which HOA they were representing. They named the neighborhood association whose boundaries ended at the road bordering my property. Asked them if they had verified that my property was within that association's jurisdiction before entering. They looked at each other briefly. One of them said that the property was adjacent to the community and that they had been directed to include adjacent properties showing potential violations in their inspection sweep. Asked them who had given them that direction. Neither of them had a clear answer to that. I told them calmly and directly that my vineyard was not part of their HOA, had never been part of their HOA, and that they were currently standing on private agricultural land without my permission and without any legal authority to be there. I told them that every photograph they had taken, every note they had made, and every citation they were planning to issue was based on a jurisdiction that did not exist. One of them started to respond, but I was not finished. I told them I needed them to leave my property immediately, and that I would be following up on this situation through the appropriate channels. I took photographs of both of them, their vehicle and their HOA identification before they left. They left quickly. The confident stride they had arrived with was noticeably absent on the way out. I went inside, and made several calls. The first was to my attorney. My attorney listened to everything carefully and then asked me one question. He asked whether I had documented the intrusion properly. I told him I had photographs of both officers on my property, their vehicle, their HOA identification, and timestamps on everything. He told me that was exactly what we needed, what the enforcement company had done by entering my private agricultural property without permission and without any jurisdictional authority was not simply an administrative error. It was trespassing. 2 individuals had entered my land without my consent, conducted an unauthorized inspection, photographed my private property, and prepared citations for rules that had absolutely no application to me. The fact that they were acting under the direction of an HOA made it worse, not better, because it meant the organization had sent people onto land it had no authority over. My attorney sent a formal legal notice to both the HOA and the enforcement company within 48 hours. The notice outlined the trespass, the complete absence of jurisdictional authority, the unauthorized photography of private property, and the preparation of fraudulent citations for a non-member. It also outlined what we intended to pursue if the matter was not addressed formally and immediately. The response came faster than I expected. The HOA board president called my attorney within 2 days. The tone of that conversation, as my attorney described it to me afterward, was one of people who had just realized the size of the mistake that had been made on their behalf. The president acknowledged that my property was outside their jurisdiction. She acknowledged that the enforcement officers should never have entered my land. She offered an immediate formal written apology, my attorney told her the apology was appreciated but that it was not the only thing we were looking for. We pursued a formal trespass claim against the enforcement company directly. Their insurance covered the settlement. The amount was not enormous, but it was significant enough to matter, and it covered every legal cost I had incurred plus additional damages for the unauthorized entry and photography of my private property. The HOA also paid for an independent review of their enforcement procedures and boundary documentation to ensure this could never happen to any other adjacent property owner again. That review was a condition I insisted on personally, not because I wanted to create more work for them, but because I knew that if their enforcement team had done this to my vineyard, they had likely done something similar. Elsewhere, the enforcement company revised their entire jurisdiction verification process as a result of the claim. Before any inspection, they now required written confirmation that the property in question was within the HOA boundaries, a simple step that should have existed from the beginning. Both officers were retrained. The one who had directed the sweep to include adjacent properties was let go by the company shortly afterward, though that was their internal decision and not something I had requested. I want you to understand something important about why I pursued this the way I did. I was not angry. I was not looking to cause maximum damage to people who had made an honest mistake about boundaries. But what happened on my vineyard that morning was not a minor clerical error. 2 people walked onto my private land, photographed it without permission, and prepared legal documents citing violations of rules I was never subject to. That has consequences regardless of intent, and those consequences needed to be real enough that the same thing would never happen to anyone else. My vineyard has not been visited by anyone with a clipboard since that morning. The HOA boundary line, which was apparently unclear to their enforcement team, is now marked with complete precision on every document their organization uses. They walked onto my land, thinking they had authority they did not have. They left with photographs they had no right to take, and citations that were worth nothing. The bill that followed made sure the lesson stuck.